Askell Vorn did what a healer must never do. He placed his palm on the torn side and did not close the wound. He opened it wider. Blood gushed out in spurts. Oben Rask arched his back and gasped. Askell did not remove his hand. He kept the wound open because he could not close it. A gray thread closes a cut. A gray thread heals a burn and sets a finger. A gray thread does not close a hole in a person. And there was a hole in Oben Rask. A whole palm fit inside it. The slit beneath Tarnhold's old saltworks held for 9 days. The Merholt Guild made 4 runs through it. Darvin Skoll's squad bought the last one, and they bought it cheap. Cheap meant no right to a second trip. 7 of them entered the salt vault at dawn. 6 of them were now standing in the damp chamber, watching the 7th. Light came from a measuring stone. It was the size of a fist and burned with an even white flame, burning out exactly in 1 trip. When the stone went out, the mouth of the shaft closed. Half of the stone remained inside. Askell wasn't counting the time. He was counting his steps. From the chamber to the mouth of the shaft, it was 200 steps up the scree. Oben couldn't be dragged 200 steps. Oben couldn't even be dragged 20. Darvin Skoll came to the same conclusion, and faster. He wiped his blade on his boot and said the squad was leaving. He said Oben was already dead and simply didn't know it yet. He said the healer would stay with him. He said this calmly and without malice. That made it even worse. Mireille called said that wasn't how things were done. Darvin replied that this was always how it was done, and that she was seeing it for the first time only because she'd been lucky before. Gavir Tal said nothing. Gavir Tal adjusted the strap of his bag and was the first to head toward the scree. Askell understood the meaning of the order immediately. They were leaving him to be untreated. They were leaving him to make a racket. The empty ones are drawn to blood and to sound. The 2 living ones in the lower hall are holding the empty ones down below while the 5 go upstairs. That was the old price, and it was always paid by the back row. Askell had stood in the back row for 4 years. For 4 years, they'd placed him behind the spearman and called him the Gray Thread. Behind his back, they called him the Meat Thread. A meat thread is someone they take into the squad just so there's someone to leave behind. He'd known that from the very first mission. He went anyway. He went because the Gray Thread didn't offer any other work, and he had to eat every day. Darvin walked away without looking back. Mireille turned around once. She looked at Askell the way one looks at an object they've forgotten and have already decided not to go back for. Then the salt crunched under their boots, and the sound faded upward. Askell was left with Oben and half a measure stone. Oben Rask weighed as much as 2 doors. For 4 years, Oben Rask had walked in front, taking the blows meant for Askell onto his shield. Oben Rask never thanked him and never said anything nasty to him. He simply walked in front. Now he lay on the salt, his side exposed, revealing what should not be seen. Askell dropped to his knees. He called for the thread. The Gray Thread came as it always did. It was thin and warm, and just long enough to wrap around a finger. It settled on the edges of the gash and tried to pull them together, but it snapped. Askell called again. The thread snapped again. He called for it 11 times. On the 11th time, blood began to flow from his nose, and his left eye went dark. The wound remained the same. 4 years ago, during a winter thaw, he had knelt just like this over a boy named Tobret. Tobret had been crushed by a beam while dismantling an old drying shed. Askell kept calling out to the thread until he lost consciousness. Tobret died before Askell came to. Since then, Askell had known one thing about himself, and he knew it for certain. He knew how to keep a hand on a person and not change a thing. A sound came from the side passage. The empties move silently, and the sound doesn't come from their feet. Their sound comes from the air. The air moves before them as if before a closing door. Askell raised his head. The first one stood in the doorway. The void ones are a head taller than a man. They have no faces. There is a place where a face should be, and it is smooth. They do not growl, and they do not hurry. They approach and take. Askell looked at his palm. His palm was covered in Oben's blood up to his wrist. He thought of something very simple. He thought that his whole life he'd been trying to get rid of the wound, and that a wound cannot be gotten rid of. A wound can only be put somewhere else. He didn't call for the thread. He took the wound in his hand. He took it the way one takes a wet rag. He felt its weight. The wound had weight. It was heavy and slippery, and it clung to Oben no more firmly than a nail clings to rotten wood. Askell pulled. The wound came away. The empty space in the opening folded in half. His side opened up in exactly the same way. A hand could have fit inside entirely. He sank to his knees and began to fall onto his side, never to rise again. Askell sat and looked at his hand. A line appeared on the back of his left hand. It was gray and thin and ran from the knuckle to the wrist. It looked like a line of text. Askell realized he was reading it. He read it the way one reads an IOU at a shop. The IOU stated 3 things. The wound does not disappear. The wound has a keeper. The keeper can be replaced. And beneath that, a 4th thing was written. A price is charged for the replacement. Askell didn't know what a price was. He learned it in a single breath. His left hand grew cold. It didn't hurt. It was just cold. The skin from his knuckle to his wrist turned gray and stayed gray. He bent his fingers. His fingers obeyed. They simply no longer felt any warmth. 3 more emerged from the side passage. Askell stood up. He placed both palms on Oben and found a second wound. It was below his collarbone and deep. He pulled it out and threw it at the nearest empty one. The empty one stopped mid-step. Black fluid oozed from beneath his collarbone. He sat down on the salt, and his smooth face turned toward Askell as if he wanted to ask a question. There was nothing left to ask. Askell found a 3rd wound. It was on the thigh and tore the flesh down to the bone. He removed it and threw it away. The 2nd hollow fell. The 3rd stepped right up close and raised his hand. Askell thrust his palm into the man's chest and gave him everything that remained in Oben. Bruises, cracked ribs, a torn shoulder muscle, blood loss. He even gave away an old, malunited fracture in his shin that was about 10 years old. The empty one crumbled from within and slumped to the ground. Askell stood there, breathing through his mouth. His left arm was gray up to the elbow. He coughed, and something dark settled in his palm. He looked at Oben. Oben Rask lay there, unharmed. His side had healed. The skin was fresh and pink with no scar. He breathed deeply and evenly, like a man sleeping after hard work. Askell sat down next to him, right on the salt. He looked at his gray hand and thought not of strength. He thought of Tobrit, and how the beam had been just a few steps away back then, and how everything could have been shifted onto it. The measuring stone had burned down to 1/4 of its size. Mireille Caldes returned alone. She came down from above along the scree slope, stopped in the opening, and did not go any further. She saw 3 dead, empty bodies. She saw Oben unharmed. She saw a gray hand. Mireille Caldes had been a scout for 11 years and knew how to hide her emotions. This time, she couldn't keep her composure. She opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again. She said she had come back for the bodies. Askell replied that there were no bodies. Mireille asked him what he had done, and her voice broke halfway through. Askell wanted to explain. He opened his mouth and realized there was nothing to explain. He said he had moved them. Mireille looked at the empties, then at Aubin, and repeated the words silently. She said that for something like this, they'd be taken away. Askell asked who would take him away. Mireille replied that it was the guild. The two of them had been carrying Aubin, and halfway up the slope, he'd started walking on his own. He didn't understand what had happened. He remembered the blow and the salt on his lips, but nothing after that. He felt his side under his shirt, but couldn't find the seam, so he felt there again. Darvin's skull was standing by the opening. He had his back to the slit and was talking to someone right by the exit. He turned at the sound. Askell saw his face for exactly one breath and remembered that face forever. At first, Darvin saw Mireille and wasn't surprised. Then he saw Aubin standing on his own 2 feet. Darvin's skull had led squads through the rifts for 14 years. He had seen men with their sides ripped open 9 times, and all 9 times he had buried them, or not. He looked at Aubin and his jaw dropped slightly, though he didn't notice it. Then he saw Askell's gray hand, and that's when his expression changed a second time. It was no longer surprised. It became sharp. Darvin stepped right up close. He didn't ask how. He said that no one talks about it. He said that, out loud, it would be like this. Aubin survived because the blow had grazed him. The healer dragged him away on a stretcher. That was all there was to it. Mireille said that was a lie through and through. Darvin replied that the guild doesn't take people in for lying. The guild takes people in for the unrecorded. Askell asked what unrecorded meant. Darvin explained briefly, and the explanation made Askell's mouth go dry. Every job in Tarnhold is recorded. A healer's thread is recorded in the guild registry by color. Gray is for bruises and costs 4 copper coins a day. Copper is for fractures. Blue is for internal injuries. There are 2 white healers in the city. Both live in the upper quarter and both belong entirely to the Merholt Guild. If a person develops something not listed in the registry, it cannot exist. And whatever cannot exist, the guild puts on record. Darvin spoke the last sentence slowly. He said that it's not the work that's registered. It's the person who's registered. Askell understood. He hid his left hand in his sleeve. They stepped out of the passageway into the salt yard, and the measuring stone went dark behind them as the vault closed with a wet sound. The courtyard was bright and damp, and it smelled of smoke. A table stood by the gate. A man in dark clothing sat at the table, and a device lay before him. The device was made of copper and glass, and a needle hung from it by a single hair. The man's name was Lenvar Gis. He was the accountant for the Merholt Guild, and he had been sitting by these gates every day for 9 days in a row. Accountants do not fight. Accountants measure. Everyone who emerges from the passage walks past the table, and the needle indicates how much power has passed through the person per visit. That's how the guild calculates taxes. That's how the guild calculates other things, too. Darvin went first, and the needle wavered slightly. Mirette passed through, and the needle wavered slightly. Gavir Tal passed through, and the needle wavered more strongly, and Gis wrote down 2 lines. Aubin passed through, and the needle didn't move at all, and Gis looked up at him. Aubin Rask was covered in dried blood. He didn't have a single wound. Gis wrote down 1 line and stared at it longer than necessary. Askell was the last to approach the table. He kept his left hand tucked into his sleeve and held it tightly. He thought that it would all end now, and that it would end quickly. The needle twitched by a hair's breadth, veered off to the side, and came to rest at the edge of the scale, where it remained. It wasn't trembling. It lay on the stopper like the pointer of a scale that had snapped past its limit. Lenvar Gis stared at the needle for a very long time. Then he raised his head and looked at Askell Vorn. He didn't ask anything. He didn't call for the guards. He took a quill and wrote something on the right side of the sheet, not the left. The right side of the sheet was not for tax purposes. Askell didn't know that. He found out 2 days later. Gis let the ink dry and said in an even voice that the port was closed and that the detachment was free to go. Then he said one more thing, and he said it only to Askell in a low voice. He said that the gray thread cost 4 copper coins a day. He said that 4 copper coins a day was very little for a man who had exceeded the limit today. And he said that the Merhold Guild knew how to pay more, and knew how to pay in a single lump sum. Askell didn't leave the table. He stood there looking at the needle resting on the support and realized it was too late to leave. Lenvar Gis held the pen in the air and waited. He waited calmly, like a man who gets paid to wait. Askell said the device was broken. Gis replied that the device had been measuring for 9 days straight and hadn't broken. Askell said that then it must have broken today. Gis nodded and wrote down that sentence as well. He was writing everything down, and that was the worst part. Askell did the only thing he could think of. He remembered the line on his wrist and recalled the third line. The host can be changed. He thought that if a wound can be removed from one person and placed on another, that it can be removed without being placed anywhere. It can be held. He drew the cold that lingered in his left hand toward himself and pulled it deeper. He drew it from his skin inward. The needle wavered slightly and slowly moved back toward the center of the scale. Lenvar Gis stared at it without blinking. The needle reached the center and stopped. Askell stood perfectly still. His mouth tasted salty, and he didn't swallow because there was nothing to swallow but blood. Gis wrote another line and released him with a flick of his fingers. Askell took 10 steps away from the table and doubled over. He braced his palms against his knees and vomited darkly onto the wet stone of the courtyard. Oben Rask approached and stood beside him so that he wouldn't be visible from the table. He didn't ask anything. He just stood there. There was more support in that than in anything Askell had heard in 4 years. That was how Askell learned the second rule, and he learned it the hard way. A debt doesn't have to be passed on right away. A debt can be taken on and held onto. As long as it's with you, the needle can't see it. The needle sees the flow, not what's being held. But what's held back doesn't lie still. It consumes. The settlement for the run was to take place in the guild's courtyard in an hour. Darvin's skull spread out a leather bag on a barrel and counted aloud. The run had failed. They brought out 8 cannonballs, 2 bars of salt iron, and 1 empty shell from the slit. The Merhold Guild took a third for entry and the same amount again for the right to sell. Little remained. Darvin divided the remainder into 5 parts. Mireille called said there were 7 in the squad. Darvin replied that Oben's share went into the common pot because Oben hadn't done his job and had lost his shield. He said that the healer's share was cut in half because the healer hadn't kept the shield bearer on his feet. He placed 9 copper coins in front of Askell. 9 copper coins were 2 days' worth of food in the lower quarter. Askell looked at the 9 copper coins and at the gray brush under his sleeve and said nothing. He took the money. He took it because refusing would have meant a conversation, and that conversation would have been about what had happened downstairs. Oben Rask took his 0 copper coins in silence. Then he approached Askell out on the street and said 1 sentence. He said he remembered the salt on his lips and remembered that it was dark after that and that the darkness had ended. He said he didn't know what it was called. He said he walked first for a share and that from now on he would walk first for free. Askell replied that he wasn't asking. Oben said he hadn't asked either. That's how Askell Vorn got his first man. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on his mattress above the dye house, holding his left arm out in the air and staring at it in the streetlight. The gray had risen another 2 fingers' width from his elbow. It didn't hurt. It was just creeping upward slowly, like water on a rag. Askell realized something very simple. What he had held back at Giss's table hadn't gone anywhere. It was inside him, and it was growing. In the morning, he went looking for someone who could explain it. Mireille found him herself at the water tap. She said she hadn't slept either. She said that if he went with this to the cooperative's healer, he'd be registered by evening. She gave a name, Satra Velm. Mireille said that Satra had been a blue thread and had run the cooperative's infirmary for 11 years, and that she'd been thrown out beyond the gates without a release letter. Mireille didn't know why she'd been thrown out. She knew where she lived. Satra Velm lived above the tannery by the eastern wall. The smell there was so bad that no one settled in the alley. She didn't open the door right away. She was a gaunt old woman with a straight back and a scarred right side of her face. The burn was old and shriveled, running from her temple to her collarbone. She looked at Askell and said she served meals on Tuesdays. Askell showed her his left hand. Satra Velm looked at the gray wrist and the line running from the knuckle to the wrist. She said it was dirt. She said that the gray thread leaves no traces because the gray thread does nothing. She said the boy had come to the wrong place. Askell didn't argue. He asked if he could touch her face. The old woman laughed hoarsely and said that such a request was usually made differently, and at her age, people didn't ask for such things at all anymore. Then she saw that he wasn't joking. She sat down on a stool by the door and offered up the side of her face that had been burned. Askell placed his palm on the taut skin. He took the burn in his hand. The burn had weight to it. It was light and dry and very old, and it held on more firmly than a fresh wound because the body had already had time to fuse with it. Askell held it for a long time. Then the burn came away. He gathered it in his fist, turned around, and threw it at a piece of dried meat hanging from the lintel. The meat turned black and curled up, and something oozed from it. Satra Velm didn't move. She sat with her hands on her knees. Then she raised her right hand and touched her temple, then her collarbone. Then she ran her palm across the entire side of her face. Her skin was smooth. It was pale and young, and fine hairs were growing on it. The old woman sat there, touching her face, and remained silent for a very long time. She had been the blue thread for 11 years and had never heard of anyone removing a burn scar from a quarter of a century ago. That sort of thing isn't treated. That's something you learn to live with. She stood up, locked the door with 2 turns of the key, sat back down, and said that now the boy would tell everything from the beginning. He told her about the salt works, and about Oben, and about the empty ones, and about Giss's needle, and about how he'd held on to the table. Satra listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said a phrase that he would later repeat to himself many times. She said that he wasn't a healer. She said that he had never been a healer, and that for 4 years they had taught him the wrong thing. A healer adds, "A healer expends his own power and places it into another's body, and the body heals itself. That's why the blue thread works for 3 hours and then sleeps for a day. That's why there are 2 whites in the city." Askell adds nothing. Askell transfers. He takes an existing injury and changes its host. He doesn't expend any of his own power at all. Satra said that this isn't healing. It's a matter of accounting. The guild's accountants measure the flows and record them in a book. They know how to record. He knows how to transcribe. Then she mentioned payment and spent the most time talking about it. She took his left hand, turned it toward the light, and pointed to a line. She said that every transfer leaves a residue. The residue is the part of the damage that didn't reach the new host and settled on the intermediary. She asked how much he had transferred yesterday. Askell counted. 4 large ones, plus what was held back at the table. Satra said that the gray had reached his elbow in 5 transfers. She said he had 2 arms. She said that next came the shoulders and then the chest, and that she'd seen people in whom the gray had reached the chest. Askell asked what happened next. Satra replied that nothing happened after that. She said she'd seen such people in the guild wing, and that they'd been brought in from the northern passages, and that the guild hadn't spent a single thread on them. She said the guild had catalogued them. Askell asked if the remainder could be removed. Satra said it could, and that it would require a host strong enough to withstand it. A living holder wouldn't last long. Flesh wouldn't last at all. You need an object capable of holding something that isn't its own. She mentioned a word: pledge. She said that a pledge is an old object and that there isn't a single such object in Tarnhold. She said that pledges are retrieved from the deep fissures and that the Marehold Guild has brought out 3 in recent years. All 3 are kept in her upper house, and all 3 are recorded. Askell asked what the pledge looked like. Satra replied that she didn't know. She said she'd seen it once from behind, on a stretcher, covered by a cloth. She said it gave off a chill 20 paces away. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and said the last thing she would say that day. She said that was why she'd been expelled. She said she'd been writing about the surplus in her reports for 11 years. She said she'd asked the guild to factor the surplus into the cost of the shipment. She said Halder Merholt listened to her 4 times, and on the 5th time, he shut her out and escorted her out the gate without a letter. Because if you factor in the surplus, the shipment becomes more expensive, and a run has to be cheap. Askell walked home in the dark, thinking not about the deposit. He thought about the 9 copper coins on the barrel. He thought about how he'd stood in the back row for 4 years, how they called him Meat String, and how yesterday he'd knocked down 3 empty barrels with 1 hand and received 9 copper coins and half a hand for it. He thought that now he had something that couldn't be, and that in this city, they keep track of things that can't be. They were waiting for him at the dye house. There were 2 of them, standing at the entrance to his stairwell, making no attempt to hide. One was dressed in dark clothes, and Askell recognized him. Lenvar Gis kept his hands tucked in his sleeves and was freezing. The second was from the guild's city guard and stood there simply for the sake of standing. Gis said he wouldn't come inside. He said he'd come to deliver a document and that documents were handed over in person. He took out a folded sheet of paper and handed it over. The sheet was thick and bore Merholt's seal. Askell unfolded it by the lantern. It wasn't a registration order. It was an invitation. The Mareholt Guild invited Askell Vorn, healer of the Grey Thread, to the upper house the day after tomorrow at dawn. At the bottom was a note stating that attendance was mandatory and that failure to appear would result in permanent exclusion from any of Tarnhold's gateways. Askell looked up. He asked why they needed him. Lenvar Gis answered honestly, and that honesty sent a chill down his spine. He said that a man lay in the upper house and that this man had been lying there for 11 days. He said that both white threads of the city had examined this man and both had refused. He said it was neither a wound nor an illness. He uttered a word that is never spoken aloud in Tarnhold, and he said it as casually as one might talk about the weather. He said that a curse lay upon the man. Then he adjusted his sleeves and added 2 more sentences. He said that yesterday, at the gate of the salt works, the needle had landed on the stop, and that in 9 years of service, he had seen the stop twice. He said that both times something had changed in the town afterward, and he said that he had written Askel's name on the right side of the sheet, and that the right side of the sheet was not for taxes. The right side of the sheet was for fines. They led him to the upper house through the delivery courtyard. This was done on purpose, and Askel realized it. Guests use the main entrance. Meat and coal are brought in through the delivery courtyard. Oben Raska was left at the gate. Oben sat down on a pedestal and said he would stay there until Askel came out. The guard told him he wasn't allowed to sit there. Oben looked at him, and the guard went back to his booth. The Merholt house stood on a cliff above the lower quarter, and it was warm everywhere inside. It had been 4 years since Askel had been in a place where it was warm everywhere. He walked down the hallway, counting the doors, and at the 7th one, they led him inside. The room was large and cold. It was the only cold spot in the entire house, and the cold emanated from the bed. A man lay on the bed. His name was Kel Orden, and he had been the first spearman of the Merholt Guild for 9 years in a row. Askel had seen him twice at the General Review, and both times from a distance. Kel Orden was large, red-haired, and loud. Now he was gray. He lay still, breathing irregularly, and his skin was dry as paper. Shadows moved beneath his skin. They moved slowly and did not follow the flow of his blood. They traveled upward from his left foot and had already reached his waist. Wherever the shadow passed, the flesh sank in. The foot was no longer a foot. It was the shape of a foot on bone. 3 people stood by the bed. Halder Merholt was short, thin, and very calm. He was wearing travel clothes in his own home, and that said everything about him. Standing next to him was a woman named Teaviation, Lan, a white thread of the city. She held her hands clasped and stared at the floor. The third was Lenvar Gis, with his device on his belt. Halder Merholt spoke immediately, without preamble. He said that Kella Ordana had been taken on the 11th day after entering the Northern Rift, and that it was not a wound. He said that Tea Lan had worked on him for 3 sessions, sacrificing 2 days' sleep, and had halted the shadow for 4 hours, after which the shadow moved on. He said that the second white thread had refused to enter the room. He said that he had not summoned the gray thread by mistake. He looked directly at Askel and said that yesterday's device at the salt works interested him more than the color of the thread. Tea Lan raised her head and spoke. She spoke politely, and that politeness was repulsive. She said she understood Mr. Merholt's desire to try everything. She said that a curse is not a wound, and that it cannot be sealed or pulled out. She said that a curse is a condition. It is inscribed in a person like a clause in a contract, and it fulfills itself. She said that the gray thread in this room is as useless as a bucket in a fire at an oil warehouse. Then she said one last thing, addressing Askel directly. She said that if the boy started and failed, the shadow would move faster, and that then the boy would be to blame. Askel listened to her and looked at Kel Orden's leg. He was thinking about something else entirely. He thought that the shadow had a shape. He thought that anything with a shape also had weight. He walked over to the bed. Tea Lan took a step back. Halder Merholt didn't move. Askel placed his palm on Kel Orden's shin, above where the flesh ended. He didn't call for the thread. He took it. He expected it to feel like a wound. It wasn't like a wound. A wound lies on top of the body. The curse sat inside and did not cling to the flesh. It clung to the body itself, just as a root clings to the earth. It had weight, and that weight was great. Askel pulled and moved nothing, and a ringing filled his ears. He pulled a second time and realized what the matter was. He hadn't been pulling on the right thing. He'd been pulling on the shadow, but the shadow wasn't the curse. The shadow was the curse's work. It was like pulling on smoke instead of fire. He closed his eyes and began searching for the spot where it was embedded. He searched for a long time. The room was silent, and Tea Lan's breathing was louder than anyone else's. He found it. It wasn't in his leg. It was under his left collarbone, the size of a fingernail and very dense. Askell pinched it between 2 fingers through the skin. He pulled it out the way one removes a tick. He pulled it out whole, root and all, and felt Kell Orden's body shudder all at once, from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. The shadows beneath the skin stood on end. Then they went back down. They retreated quickly, and wherever they retreated, the flesh returned. The shin reformed. The ankle became an ankle. The foot took its shape in the time it would take to take 10 breaths. Kell Orden opened his eyes and screamed. He screamed because sensation had returned to him all at once. Taya Lan stepped back toward the wall and pressed her back against it. She had been a white thread for 22 years. She looked at the foot that wasn't there and yet was, and her face was covered in spots. She said aloud that this couldn't be. She repeated it 3 times, each time more quietly. Halder Merholt wasn't looking at Kell Orden. He was looking at Askell's hand, because there was a curse in Askell's hand. It lay between his thumb and index finger. It was black and matte, and thin gray threads ran along its edge, searching for something to latch onto. It weighed like a pebble and was cold. Askell held it and realized 2 things at once. First, it was looking for a host and would find one within a few breaths, and the nearest host was himself. Second, he no longer had a free hand to throw it at a piece of meat. And then Lenvar Gis did something that explained this whole house to Askell. He didn't help. He took a device off his belt, held it up to his palm, and began recording the readings. Askell looked at the door. Standing by the door was a man he hadn't noticed until that very moment. It was the guild clerk. He had been standing there from the very beginning, holding a slate, and hadn't said a word the entire time. Askell asked Halder Merholt one thing, and he asked it quickly. He asked who had placed the order. Merholt answered just as quickly. He said that the order had come from the Tolvain Guild, that the contractor's name was Merrick Still, that he had been sitting in the basement of this house for 4 days, and that they hadn't been able to get anything out of him. Askell ordered that he be brought in. Merholt did not give the order immediately. He looked at the gray hand and the black between the fingers and counted something inside himself. Then he nodded. Merrick Still was brought in after 100 heartbeats. Askell counted them, and each beat reverberated with a chill in his left palm. The gray threads on the pebble had already found his skin and penetrated it by a hair's breadth. Merrick Still was young and thin, and there were no signs of interrogation on him. Artel Merholt knew how to question without leaving a trace. He entered the room and saw Kell Orden sitting on the bed, feeling his foot. And that was when his expression changed. It wasn't the look of an enemy. It was the look of a craftsman who'd been shown that his work had fallen apart. He took a step back and bumped into a guard. Askell approached him and placed his palm on his chest. He didn't explain anything. He simply handed it over. The pebble slipped from his fingers into Merrick Still's chest and slipped under his skin without drawing blood. Merrick stood there for 3 more breaths and felt nothing. On the 4th, he looked down at his left foot. Askell spoke a single sentence, delivering it evenly. He said that it was now his. Halder Merholt asked, without taking his eyes off Merrick, how much time he had left. Askell estimated based on what he'd seen on Kella Ordain. He said that on Kella, the shadow had spread to the waist in 11 days. He said that on his master, it would spread faster because the body wouldn't resist it. He had underestimated it. Merrick Still sat down on the floor an hour later. By evening, he could no longer feel either of his legs. He died on the 3rd day, quietly, and the Merholt Guild recorded his death as an accident in the basement. The room grew very quiet. Kell Ordan sat on the bed and looked at Askell the way one looks at a priest. Taya Lan stood by the wall and did not move from it. Lenvar Gis was writing. Halder Merholt was silent for a long time. Then he said that Askell Vorn had just done 3 things in his house. He had returned the first spear to the guild. He had shown that a curse could be returned to the sender, and he had demonstrated this in front of 7 witnesses. Merholt said that the first was worth money, the second is worth a great deal of money, and the third is worth a war. Askell asked, why a war? Merholt explained calmly, as one would explain a math problem to a child. He said that the Tolvain Guild holds the northern passes and maintains its hold through curses. He said that a curse is costly and slow, which is why it is used rarely and why it works. He said that in 20 years in Tarnhold, a curse had been lifted twice, and both times the person was left crippled. He said that today, the curse hadn't been lifted. It had been returned. He said that Tolvain would find out about this before sunset because, out of the 7 witnesses, 2 would definitely sell out. And he said that after that, every guild in the city would have only one thought, that Merholt has a man who knows how to return everything to the sender. He looked at Askell and added in a quieter voice, he said that this wasn't a thought about a healer. It was a thought about a weapon. Askell stood in the middle of the warm house, holding his left arm inside his sleeve. The gray had reached his shoulder in a single removal. He could feel it beneath his shirt as a cold strip. He thought about Satra Velm and her words about seeing people whose gray reached their chests. And he thought that he had just earned his first big reward and didn't yet know how much it would be. Halder Merholt named the payment for today and didn't call it money. He said that the Merholt Guild was adding Askell Vorn to the registry, not with a gray thread, but as a separate entry. He said that a separate entry granted access to any of the city's passageways without having to purchase a pass, entitled him to a quarter of the hall, and provided housing in the upper quarter. Askell asked what a separate entry in the guild's register entailed. Merholt smiled for the first time all morning. He said that a separate entry meant registration. He said that registration wasn't a prison, and that it was simply a record, and that a person registered with the guild could not work for another guild, could not leave the city without a letter, and could not refuse a summons. Askell looked at Kell Orden, at Gis, and at the clerk by the door, and realized that the document had already been written. It had been written before he even entered the room. He asked if he could have until evening to think it over. Merholt replied that he could, and that nothing would change by evening. He was wrong. By noon, everything had changed. Askell walked out through the supplier's courtyard and found Oben Rask sitting on a bench. Oben stood up and they walked down the street. At the third turn, a group of people was coming toward them. There were many of them, and they weren't guards. Leading the way was a woman in an expensive cloak. She was walking quickly, and behind her, bearers were carrying a covered stretcher. She saw Askell and stopped so abruptly that the stretcher bearers nearly knocked her over. She looked at him, and Askell couldn't figure out how she knew him. Then he saw Darvin Skoll behind her. Darvin Skoll didn't look him in the eye. He was looking away, keeping his hands behind his back, and a new purse hung from his belt. The woman said her name was Irma Tolvain. She said she wouldn't go to Merholt's house. She said her son was lying in the stretcher, that he'd been there for 4 months, and that the same thing was happening to him. She said she'd pay whatever amount Askell asked for. And then she said something that sent a chill down Askell's spine even more than the gray in his shoulder. She said she knew about the balance. She said she knew how much he had already saved up. She said the Tolvain Guild had a pledge, and that she would hand it over in full for a single job. Askell did not answer Irma Tolvain right away. He looked at the stretcher, the cloak, and Darvin Skoll standing behind her. Then he said he wanted to see the pledge before they spoke. Irma Tolvain did not argue. She gave a signal, and one of the porters set a chained box down on the pavement. The box was small, It was about the size of a breadbasket and was carried by 2 men. The woman lifted the lid herself. Inside lay a ring made of dull metal. It was as thick as a finger and the size of a saucer, with neither pattern nor seam. It radiated cold. The cold reached Askell 4 paces across the cobblestones, and his teeth began to chatter. Oben Rask took half a step back without even realizing it. Satravelm had said that the cold from the pledge extended 20 paces. She hadn't lied. Askell reached out his hand but didn't touch it. The gray in his shoulder responded. It reached for the ring like water flows toward a slope. He understood everything in a single breath. The ring can hold what belongs to others. The ring will take the remainder. The ring is the only thing in the city that can remove from him what he has already accumulated. Irma Tolvain closed the lid and said that now he would look at her son. Odd Tolvain lay on a stretcher under 3 blankets and was still freezing. He was 19. He was sallow and gaunt, and his eyes followed the people intently. His condition was worse than Kella ordains. In Kella, the shadow had been moving for 11 days, following a single path. In Odd, the shadows had been moving for 4 months, going everywhere. Askell placed his palm on the young man's chest and began searching for the root. There was no root. There were 7. The curse lay within the young man 7 times over. It had taken root in his collarbone, both hips, his neck, his upper abdomen, his wrist, and the back of his head. Each knot was small, and each held fast to its place. Askell counted them and understood the arithmetic. 1 knot is a shoulder. 7 knots is the chest. Satravelm had seen people in whom the gray had reached the chest, and the guild did not treat them but merely documented them. He withdrew his hand and said he would remove them. He said he would not remove them immediately, and that a holder was needed for each knot. Irma Tolvain said that holders would be found. She said it matter-of-factly, and Askell realized that she already had the holders, that they were alive, and that they were sitting somewhere in her house. Then she stated her condition. She said she wouldn't hand over the pledge just like that. She said that what was removed from her son must not go to the butcher nor to a stranger. It must go back to the one who ordered it. She named a name, Halder Merholt. Askell was silent for a long time. He looked at the box with the ring and weighed not the knots but the consequences. Irma Tolvain was offering him the chance to cure his son, kill the head of the Merholt syndicate, and in return receive the one thing that would prolong his life. He said he'd think about it. Irma Tolvain replied that he needed to decide quickly because her son had been bedridden for 4 months and that she had people who were counting the days along with her. A commotion arose from the upper street. There were 8 of them, led by Kell Orden. He walked quickly, clad in armor, and didn't limp at all. 3 days ago, he had no foot. The Tolvains took up their weapons, and Merholt's men stood opposite them, leaving a 10-step wide gap in the street between them. No one struck a blow. Askell stood exactly in the middle and realized he was standing there not as a human being. Kell Orden said that Lord Merholt was waiting for an answer by evening. Irma Tolvain said that Mr. Merholt could wait until winter. Kell Orden said that the healer was listed on the right side of the sheet and that the right side of the sheet belonged to the guild that had made the entry. Irma Tolvain laughed and said that an entry wasn't a purchase. Lenvar Gis stepped out from behind Merholt's men. He was unarmed. He held a leather-bound book under his arm. It was thick and old. Gis said that both were right and that both were wrong, and that for such cases there was a table of measures. He opened the book right there on the street and read aloud. He read evenly and without expression, and it was as repulsive as the politeness of a white thread. Any find recorded on the right side of the sheet belongs to the guild that recorded it first. If a second guild claims the find, It is put on the table of measure. The table of measure is a city procedure. The Council of Measures decides not on the basis of truth, but on the basis of a bid. The guilds put forward their own people for selection, and whichever guild's representative lasts the longest takes the find in its entirety and forever. Gis closed the book and added a single sentence of his own. He said that the find itself was not up for discussion. The Council of Measures convened in the Salt Courtyard the following morning. Askell was brought there as if he were an object. The courtyard was packed. All 4 of the city's guilds were there, along with merchants and people from the lower quarter who had come to watch. Seated at the table were 3 officials from the Council of Measures and the selection overseer, Vesk Dorn. Vesk Dorn was fat and cheerful and had been overseeing the city's selection trials for 11 years. He spoke loudly and liked to be heard. He stated the subject of the dispute aloud. He said that the Merholt Guild was claiming a find named Askell Vorn, a gray thread, submitted on the 9th day. He said that the Tolvain Guild was contesting the claim. He said that the selection would take place in 9 days and that the winner would take the find. He didn't say the word man even once. Askell stood to the side and listened as they divided him up. He remembered the 9 copper coins on the barrel. He remembered how, for 4 years, they'd put him in the back row. He thought that back then, at least, they'd forgotten him. Now they wanted him. The difference turned out to be worse. He took a step forward and said he wanted to speak. The courtyard burst into laughter. Vesk Dorn raised his hand, and the laughter subsided because the presiding officer was curious. Askell asked if there was a line in the book about a discovery that reveals itself. He asked this because the night before, Satra Velm had pored over that book for 6 hours and found it. Lenvar Gis slowly opened the book. He leafed through it for a long time. Then he stopped and read aloud. The passage was old and hadn't been used for 41 years. A find may enter the selection process with its own lot. If the find lasts longer than the people from both guilds, the entry is erased and the find becomes available. If the find loses, it goes to the guild whose member lasted longer, and it comes with a doubled term. Vesk Dorn stopped smiling halfway through the reading. He asked Askell if he understood that the selection continues until surrender or the inability to stand. Askell said he understood. Vesk Dorn asked if he knew that healing was prohibited during the selection. Askell asked how that was written in the book. Gis read the 3rd line. A participant is prohibited from accepting a thread of any color during the fight. Askell heard the word accept and realized that the line referred to the healers standing at the edge and infusing. There was nothing in the book about someone who doesn't channel anything. He said he was claiming his lot. The courtyard was silent for 2 breaths. Then the courtyard buzzed. Halder Merholt was looking at him from across the courtyard and didn't look angry. He looked like a man who was doing the math. Irma Tolvain was smiling with just her lips. Darvin Skoll stood by the wall with his hands behind his back, and the same new purse hung from his belt. Satra Velm found Askell that evening and told him he was a fool. She said she'd read him the line not so he could meddle in it. She said that in 41 years, that line had been used 4 times, and that all 4 times, the finder had lost. She said he had no luck. She said he had no armor. She said his hand was gray up to the shoulder, and that every transfer would add to it. Askell replied with a single sentence. He said that if he didn't go out, they'd hand him over to whichever guild paid, and that then the gray would reach his chest on someone else's schedule, not his own. Satra Velm fell silent. Then she said she'd come to watch. 9 days passed in 3 rounds, and each round was short. The first round took place in the dye house courtyard. Oben Rask beat him with a stick on the ribs, the shoulder, and the thigh, and he beat him without mercy. He wasn't teaching Askell how to fight. He taught Askell to stay on his feet after a blow. He said that a fighter falls not from pain, but because he wasn't expecting it. He struck without warning for 8 hours straight. On the 4th day, Askell stopped falling on the first blow. The second session took place in the room above the tannery. Satra Velm brought him 6 men from the lower quarter. They all had old injuries: a crooked, fused finger, a rotten knee, a lump under the armpit, blindness in one eye. She made him search for the knot with his eyes closed and against the clock. She placed a pig carcass in front of him, and he would rearrange the cuts within it. He learned to find the root in 6 heartbeats instead of 30. He learned to break the transfer into parts so the remainder would be thinner. The gray still rose from his shoulder to his collarbone. The third cut was at the market. Mireille Caude brought the lists. She placed them on a barrel, spoke briefly, left, and came back again. She'd been a scout for 11 years and did her job even when she didn't understand why. She was the first to say aloud what the whole courtyard would later be talking about. She said the bets in the taverns had taken a strange turn. She said that at first, no one had bet on the gray thread, and that by the 7th day, 19 people from the lower quarter had placed bets on it. She said it wasn't faith. She said it was anger toward the guild, and that people were betting copper coins just so they'd have someone to cheer for. There was a reaction from the other side, too. On the 8th day, Thea Lan came to Askell. The city's white thread came of its own accord to the lower quarter and climbed the staircase above the dye house. She stood in the doorway and did not sit down. She said that for 22 years she had believed she knew the limits of her craft. She said she had seen Kel Ordan's foot and that she hadn't slept for 3 nights afterward. She asked him one thing, and she asked it directly. She asked if he drew his power from people. Askell answered honestly. He said he took nothing. He said he merely changed the vessel. Thea Lan said that this was the most terrifying thing of all, and that if word got out, in 10 years there wouldn't be a single white thread left in the city. Then she placed a bundle on the table. Inside the bundle was a shoulder pad made of tanned leather. She said that during the selection, they strike the left shoulder because everyone sees it as gray and everyone considers it a weak spot. She left without saying goodbye. The list of participants was posted in the Salt Courtyard on the morning of the 9th day. There were 31 participants. The Merholt Guild fielded Kel Ordan. The Tolvain Guild fielded a man named Sivir Kran, and Mireille said 2 things about him. First, he was a spearman from the northern clefts. Second, over the course of 4 years, he had taken 6 men through the trials, and 3 of them never returned to work. Darvin Skoll was also on the list. He was in his own lot and appeared on the list 1 line below Askell. Askell read the list to the end, saw the last line, and understood why Vesk Dorn was smiling at the judges' table. The order of the pairs was determined by lot. The officials had drawn the lots the day before, and the first to be paired with Askelvorn was Han Breck. Everyone knew about Han Breck. He was a hammer fighter who had served in the northern front lines for 12 years, and his body had been rebuilt 4 times. The Tollane Guild paid a fortune for this. He had bone grafts over his collarbones, thickened brow ridges, and ribs fused with a 3rd plate. Mireille said he could break a man with a single blow from top to bottom, and that in 12 years, no one had ever knocked him down. Askell looked at his name and wasn't thinking about the blow. He was thinking about the word reconstructed. Askell finished reading the list and didn't go home. He went down to the tannery, woke up Satra Velm, and asked her one thing. He asked if an artificial bone count as an injury. Satra Velm sat up in bed and remained silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't know. She said that reconstruction was the work of butchers from the north and that they didn't heal. They added to the body. They broke the bone and inserted a bone wedge cut from a slit into the fracture, keeping the person in a fever for 8 days. If he survived, the bone would heal thicker. She said that the body considers this a wound for the rest of its life. She said that those who have been rebuilt are always cold and always eat twice as much, and that none of them live past 50. Askell asked again. He asked whether Hagen Breck's body considered his armor a curse or a part of himself. Satravelm looked at him, and something changed in her expression. She said that if the body considers it a burden, the burden can be removed. She said that what remains then is what was beneath it. She said there is nothing beneath it. The selection took place on the old salt parade ground behind the eastern wall. The parade ground was round and well-trodden, and along its edge stood beams as tall as a man. There were more people than at the fall fair. People sat on the wall, on the roofs of the warehouses, and on barrels. The guilds had taken up positions on the platforms. Halder Merholt sat in his traveling clothes. Irma Tolvane sat across from him, and next to her stood a covered stretcher. Askell realized she had brought her son to watch. Vesk Dorn stepped into the center and announced the rules loudly and with relish. The fight would continue until surrender or the inability to stand at the count of 20. Bring your own weapons. Bring your own armor. Accepting a thread is forbidden, and anyone caught accepting a thread is disqualified without exception. The timekeeper sits at the edge and measures the flow. The timekeeper was Lenvar Gis, and his device stood on a tripod. The first 4 pairs went by quickly.
Askell didn't watch them. He sat on the ground by the parallel bars, his left hand tucked into his sleeve, and thought about the 6 people from the lower quarter and how he'd searched for the root among them with his eyes closed. Oben Rask sat next to him, saying nothing. Mireille Cald stood by the parallel bars, biting her nail, the only sign of nervousness she'd shown in the 11 years they'd known each other. Vesk Dorn called out the 5th pair. The parade ground erupted in laughter even before Askell stood up. Hagen Breck emerged from the other side, and the laughter grew louder. He was a head taller and twice as broad. He wasn't wearing a shirt because it wouldn't fit him. A ridge of bone lay across his collarbones, running from shoulder to shoulder in a smooth arc. His eyebrows jutted out so much that his eyes were hidden in shadow. He carried a hammer with a long handle, holding it in one hand. He looked at Askell and said nothing. He wasn't a mean man. He was a workhorse. Someone from the roof shouted that it was time to bury the gray thread ahead of schedule. Someone shouted about the meat thread. Askell heard the old nickname, and it didn't bother him at all. He looked at the bone roller and tried to figure out where the bone ended and the inlay began. Veski Dorn lowered his arm. Hagen Breck stepped forward, walking slowly. He never ran. He was approaching. Askell didn't wait. He stepped toward him and moved to the right, dodging the descending hammer. The hammer passed where his head had been and struck the ground, and the ground sounded like a drum. Askell touched his thigh with his palm as he moved. He didn't take anything off. He was searching. He felt him the way one feels fabric to understand the seam. Hagen Breck spun around and caught him with a second glancing blow to the shoulder, and Askell flew back 4 paces and fell on his side. Talon's shoulder guard cracked. His shoulder remained intact. He got to his feet on the count of 4. Oben Rask beat him with a stick for 8 hours a day for 9 days, and Askell got up just as one gets up on the 9th day. The parade ground stopped laughing. He approached 3 more times. Each time he touched him. He touched a rib and realized that the 3rd plate was in place of the 4th joint. He touched the neck and realized it was empty. He touched the collarbone and found it. The pad didn't sit on the body like a bone. It sat like a splinter. It had been lodged there, and for all those 12 years, inflammation had raged around it, and the body had tried to push it out all those 12 years, but couldn't. Han Breck's body regarded its armor as a curse. It had regarded it that way every day for 12 years. The 4th strike cost Askell dearly. The hammer struck his thigh,
and his thigh gave way. He fell and couldn't brace himself. He lay on the trampled salt and heard Veska Dorn counting. He got up on the count of 15 and stood on one leg. Han Breck stepped forward to finish him off. He raised the hammer with both hands, because that's how you strike the final blow. And then, Askell placed both palms on his chest and did what he had come out to do. He did not inflict further harm. He began to heal. He took the bony roller and removed it the way one removes an old splinter along with everything that had grown around it. He removed the thickened eyebrows. He removed the third plate from the ribs. He removed the built-up tendons on the forearms. He removed them one by one, quickly. Each knot was an implant, and each implant was held in the body as if it were foreign. He was doing exactly what a healer does. He was restoring the man to a healthy appearance. The hammer did not fall. Han Breck stood with his arms raised, and his body began to shrink. The bony ridge above his collarbones subsided and dissolved, and his shoulders narrowed. His forehead smoothed out, and his eyes emerged from the shadows, appearing bright and bewildered. His chest sank. His arms became those of an ordinary, burly man in his 40s. The hammer swung over and pulled him backward. He couldn't hold on, and the hammer fell behind his back. Han Breck stood on the parade ground, completely healthy. He was healthy for the first time in 12 years. His collarbone didn't hurt. His brow didn't ache. He wasn't cold, and he couldn't do anything else. He lowered his arms and looked at his forearms and didn't recognize them. He tried to pick up the hammer from the ground and couldn't. He tried again with both hands and couldn't lift it. He sat down on the ground of his own accord. Veska Dorn didn't start counting. He forgot to start counting. A silence fell over the parade ground, the kind of silence that never happens there. The silence lingered for a long time. Then, from the roof of the warehouse above, someone said a single word, spoken softly, yet heard by everyone on the parade ground. He said that the healer had cured him. The parade ground erupted. People on the wall were shouting, not realizing what they were shouting. The entire Tolvain Guild platform stood up. Irma Tolvain wasn't looking at Askell. She was looking at Hagen Breck, sitting in the dust and calculating how much money her guild had invested in that body over the past 12 years. Halder Merholt sat motionless, neither clapping nor standing up. He was looking at Askell, and his lips were moving. Lenvar Gis later said that at that moment, Merholt, the guildmaster, was counting aloud. Standing at the edge of the plaza was the man whom Askell had turned to last. Taya Lan was holding onto the beam with both hands. For 22 years, the white thread of the city had been healing people, and her entire life she had believed that to heal meant to restore a person to wholeness. She looked at the whole Hagen Breck sitting on the ground and realized that, for the first time in her life, she had seen how wholeness kills. She let go of the beam and walked away through the crowd, and no one stopped her. Askell stood on one leg and looked at his left hand. His sleeve had ridden up. The gray had spread from his collarbone to his chest and settled beneath his throat as a patch the size of a palm. He removed 4 inserts from Hagen Breck and paid for each one. He looked up and spotted Satra Velm in the crowd. She was standing there, staring at his throat and shaking her head. Veska Dorn finally came to his senses and declared Askell Vorn the winner. The courtyard roared. Askell hobbled over to the logs and sat down, and Oben Rask offered him his shoulder. Moret called, brought him some water, and said one sentence. She said that now they would beat him without following the rules. Hagna Brekka led her men away. He walked on his own, walking steadily, and halfway there he stopped, turned around and looked at Askell across the entire parade ground. He wasn't angry. He looked the way a man looks when he's been woken up in the middle of a 12-year-long task and hasn't yet decided whether to be grateful or not. An hour later, he came to the logs on his own. The Tolvain Guild kicked him out the gate that same day because a hammer wielder without armor is just another mouth to feed. He sat down on the ground next to Askell and said he had nothing but a hammer he could no longer lift. He said he didn't know how to do anything else.
Then he said that for 12 years he'd woken up every morning with pain in his collarbones, and that today would be the first time he'd wake up without it. He said he didn't know how much they paid for that. Askell replied that he wasn't asking for anything. Hangbreck said he understood and remained seated. So Askell now had 3 men. That evening, Lenvar Gis approached him at the exit from the parade ground and looked paler than usual. He said he had 2 things to report, and that the first concerned tomorrow. He said that the draw for the second round had been rigged, and that it wasn't the officials who had done it. He said that in the second match, Askell Vorn would face Sever Cran. Then he mentioned the second thing, speaking quietly. He said that a man he hadn't invited had come to the parade ground today. He said that this man had been sitting on the platform of the city scales, had not clapped, and had left before the end of the match. He said that this man's name was Ilven Rast, and that he was the overseer of weights and measures. Askell asked what the overseer of weights and measures did. Gis replied that the office of weights and measures served neither the guilds nor the city. He said that the office of measurement serves the book. He said that the overseer comes once every few years, and that he does not come for the people. He comes for records that should not exist. And Gis said that today, Ilven Rast demanded the right-hand side of the sheet for the 9th day from him. The whole thing. In the second round of the selection, Askell faced off against the spearman Sever Cran and won by restoring all of Cran's healed wounds from the past 4 years at once, causing Cran to collapse on the parade ground from old fractures he had thought were forgotten. For the first time, the city witnessed a healer's ability to rewind the body. It's important to remember, the gray had spread from his throat to his right forearm. The overseer of measure, Ilven Rast, sat on the scales until the end of the fight and did not leave. Ilven Rast approached Askell himself and explained what the office of measurement was. It serves neither the guilds nor the city. It keeps a ledger and strikes from it whatever should not be there. Rast said that Askell's gift was not new, that such people had existed before, and that they had all been lumped into a single entry, which was then closed. It is important to remember this. Rast declared Askell unregistered and gave him until the end of the selection process. In the final round of the selection, Askell faced Kel Orden, the man whose foot he had restored 3 weeks earlier. Kel Orden surrendered of his own accord in the 4th minute and declared aloud before the entire parade ground that he would not strike the hand that had healed him. The entry on the right side of the sheet was erased, and Askell Vorn became a free man. Important to remember, freedom meant that no guild stood behind him anymore. Askell removed 6 of the 7 knots from Odd Tolvain and transferred them to the 6 debtors whom Irma Tolvain kept in the basement for this purpose. He refused to remove the 7th knot and kept it within himself because Irma demanded that he send it to Halder Merholt. It is important to remember, Askell received only half of the pledge. Irma handed him the ring but did not grant him the right to use it, leaving her son with a single knot as a leash. Darvin Skoll sold Askell's schedule and the location where Satra Velm lives to the Measurement Bureau. Ilven Rast placed the lower quarter under Measurement Bureau supervision and summoned the cleaners from the northern house. It's important to remember. The gray reached his chest and settled beneath his collarbones as a patch the size of 2 palms. Askell had 3 people left, Oben Rask, Hagen Breck,
and Miret called, and one ring he didn't know how to use. They arrived before dawn. Askell didn't hear them by their footsteps. He heard them because the alley behind the dye house had grown so quiet, quieter than it ever gets, even at night. The dogs at the tannery all fell silent at once. He got up from his mattress and walked over to the window. There were 14 cleaners. They walked in pairs, taking their time, and each had a wide gray collar around his neck. The collar was neither leather nor iron. It was made of the same dull metal as the ring in the box under the floorboard. Each wore elbow-length gloves made of boiled leather. They carried no weapons. They carried boards with lists and coils of twine. Ylvin Rask walked last and did not put on a collar. Askell woke Oben with his foot. Oben Rask sat up immediately and asked no questions. Hagen Breck had been sleeping downstairs by the entrance and was already standing. Mired Kald had been gone for 3 days because she had set out on the northern road to count the outposts. The cleaners did not break down the door. They formed a semicircle, and the elder raised the board and began to read. He read evenly and softly, and a chill ran through the alley as he spoke. He read out the names. He read the name of Dolf, the tinsmith, who lived next door. He read the name of the widow Kemma, from whom Askell had removed a tumor under her armpit 3 weeks ago and transplanted it into a pig carcass. He read the names of the 19 people who had placed their coins on the gray thread. He read, and after each name he repeated the same phrase. He said that the record was to be closed. Askell understood the meaning before he could fully process it. The authorities hadn't come for him. They had come for everyone he had touched. He stepped out onto the staircase, went down into the courtyard, and stood before them shirtless. He did it on purpose. He wanted them to see the gray. The gray stretched from his left wrist, across his shoulder and collarbone, down under his right breast, and ran down his right forearm as a separate sleeve. In the morning light, it was the color of wet ash. The senior cleaner looked at him, lowered his board, and said that the find had come out on its own, and that this made the job easier. He gave his name, Vel Torgon. He said he wouldn't hit him, and that there would be no need to hit him. He told Askell to put his hands out. Askell held out his hands. He held them out as one would when being led to the gallows. And when Vel Torgon reached out to him, Askell grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward him. He took the old injury from him. It was still there, and he found it in 4 heartbeats. Vel Torgon had a shoulder that had been dislocated and set crookedly about 8 years ago. Askell pulled it out completely and pulled it toward himself. And then something happened that he hadn't expected even once in all those weeks. The curse began to move, reached halfway, and stopped. The gray collar around the cleaner's neck grew warm. Askell felt what he had already pulled out twisting back. It traveled back up his arm twice as fast and entered him all at once, along with his own effort. He was thrown back 2 steps. He sat down on the wet planks of the courtyard, doubled over, and coughed up black clots onto the stone. His right forearm turned gray up to the elbow in a single breath. Vel Torgon adjusted his sleeve and said that the collar was called a measuring collar, that there were 80 of them in the northern house, and that the wearer could not take anything from a person wearing the collar. He said they'd known this as far back as 41 years ago. He said the find could stand on its own or be carried away. Oben Rask punched him in the jaw from the side. Oben Rask weighed as much as 2 doors and hit as hard as 2 doors, and Vel Torgon flew across the courtyard, knocking over a barrel in his path. The courtyard came crashing down. Hagen Breck grabbed 2 of them by the collars and slammed their foreheads together, and they collapsed. He was healthy for the first time in 12 years, and he was simply a large 40-year-old man, and by the 3rd cleaner, it became obvious. The 3rd one ducked in and struck him in the side, and Hagen sat down. Oben held the entrance to the staircase and held him off alone. The cleaners didn't beat people to death. They beat them to knock them down and tie them up, and they did it calmly, working in pairs. Askell got down on all fours and then back to his feet. He saw Oben get hit with a baton below the knee and still not move away from the door. He saw the second blow land on Oben's ear. He reached out toward the nearest cleaner with his palm, then remembered the collar and dropped his hand. He stood in the middle of his yard and was useless for the second time in his life. The first time was 4 years ago, over a boy named Tobret. Back then, he'd also been on his knees, pulling at the thread, and the thread kept snapping. He looked at the ground. There was a puddle at his feet. The dye house courtyard was always wet because water flowed from the vats and didn't drain away. The puddle stretched from the stairs to the barrels, and 6 people were standing in it. And in that puddle was Oben's blood, which was flowing from his ear. Askell dropped to one knee and placed both palms in the water. He didn't touch anyone. He took Oben's suffering directly through the water. He found it just as he had found it through the skin. A slashed ear, a dislocated knee, a cracked rib from the first blow. He drew all of this out and didn't hold it in. He let it flow through the puddle. The water carried it away. It spread like paint on fabric and flowed toward everyone standing in it. The collars protected their necks. The collars didn't protect their boots. 6 of them fell at the very same moment. 1 clutched his knee. 2 grabbed their heads. 1 simply lay down. The courtyard erupted. The remaining cleaners retreated from the water onto dry ground, retreating quickly and efficiently. Ylvin Rast stood by the gate, not looking at those who had fallen. He was looking at the puddle. He looked at it the way an accountant looks at a number that shouldn't be in the column. Askell got to his feet. Blood was flowing from his nose and his left ear, and he had no feeling in the left side of his face. He looked at his hands. The gray had spread up both arms to his shoulders, closed over his chest into a single patch, and was spreading down toward his ribs. He had paid 3-fold for a single crossing through the middle. He understood that, too. The medium shows no mercy. The medium smears everything, and whatever didn't make it through settles on him in its entirety. Ylvin Rast spoke a single sentence across the courtyard. He said that the discovery had just opened a transfer through the conduit, that this line in the book had been sealed for 50 years, and that now they would have to reopen the case. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it wearily, like a man who'd been given more work. Then he ordered them to leave. The cleaners picked up their people and left down the alley, taking Lenvar Gis with them, the man they'd taken from his home that night along with the sheets of paper. They didn't touch either the tinsmith Dolv or the widow Kemma. Askell realized why an hour later. The agency wasn't taking people. The agency was taking records. Vel Torgen was left lying in the courtyard because they hadn't found him under the barrel. Oben Rask pulled him out, sat him against the wall, and tied him up with his own rope. Askell removed the collar from him. It was light, and inside there was a smooth indentation for his neck. Vel Torgen remained silent. He was silent for half an hour, and he kept silent well. It was clear he'd been trained to do so. Askell didn't ask any questions. He sat down across from him, placed his hand on Vel Torgen's knee, and relieved his limp. It was an old limp, caused by a poorly healed toe on his left foot. It was a minor injury, and it had cost Askell the little finger on his right hand, which had turned gray all the way to the base. Vel Torgen placed his foot on a rock, shifted his weight onto it, lowered himself back down, and began to cry. He had been a cleaner for 9 years and had limped for 11. He told the whole story himself, all at once. He said that cleaners were chosen from among those who had gone to the northern rifts and survived. He said that the collar was not worn for protection. He said they wear the collar because every cleaner has endured something at some point, and within each one lies their own gray, and the collar keeps it in place. He said that without the collar, the gray inside him would rise to the surface within a week. Askell asked where they get the collars. Veltorgen said they don't get them. They're cast. He said they're cast in the northern house at the measuring yard, and that the measuring yard is a 3-day journey along the northern road, past the second outpost. He said that's also where they make the pledges. Askell asked what the pledges are made of, and then Veltorgen fell silent for the second time, and remained silent for a long time. And this time, his silence wasn't just for show. He said he had seen the yard only twice, and that on both occasions, it was not metal that was brought there. He said people were brought there. He said they were brought in alive, one at a time, and that they never came out again. He said that after each such delivery, there was one more ring in the yard. Askell sat there, staring at his gray hands and recalling the cold from the ring in the box under the floorboard. He recalled how the grayness in his shoulder had been drawn to that cold, just as water is drawn to a slope. He recalled Satravelm's words about how a holder was needed who could endure, and that flesh would not endure at all. He raised his head and asked one last question. He asked why the agency had come for him now and not on the first day. Veltorgen answered, and his answer made the courtyard feel colder than the collar. He said that the overseer, Rast, had not collected the find. He said that the overseer had waited until the gray reached his chest. He said that the pledge isn't cast from just any person. He said it's cast from a vessel, and that it's cast on the day the gray reaches the heart, and not before. He said the metal won't take it any sooner. He said that a ring had long been prepared for Askell Vorn, that it was on the 4th shelf in the northern house, and that a number had already been stamped on it. Askell didn't argue with himself. He got up from the courtyard and said he was heading north. Oben Rask said he was going too. Hagen Breck silently began packing his bag. Satravelm arrived around noon, heard what was being said, sat down on a step, and said he was going to a place where they would take him apart. Askell replied that he would be cut up right here, and that the only difference was who would be holding the scissors. He left her the ring in the box because it would have been foolish to carry a pledge into a house where pledges were made. Satravelm took the box with both hands and held it in the air longer than necessary, though Askell didn't notice it at the time. The journey took 3 days, and those 3 days were captured in 3 images that he would remember for the rest of his life. The first was at the first outpost. Mireille Cald was waiting for them there in the bushes by the roadside. She was angry and hungry, and she said that 9 men were manning the outpost, that all 9 were wearing collars, and that they should not take the road, but instead follow the saltworks track around it. She said she had been counting for 3 days, and that during those 3 days, 4 covered wagons had passed along the road to the north, all 4 loaded on the way there, but returning empty. She said it was quiet inside the wagons, and that was the worst part of all. The second scene took place on the second day by an abandoned salt rack. Hagen Breck sat down and couldn't get up right away. He was healthy, but he wasn't hardy, and for 12 years his body had carried itself on someone else's bones. He said that in the past he would have covered this distance in a day without even noticing. He said this without resentment. He said that now his legs ached, that it was the right kind of pain, and that he was getting used to it. Oben Rask silently took his sack and carried 2. The third scene took place at night, before the 3rd day. Askell woke up because he couldn't feel his sternum. He unbuttoned his shirt and looked. The grayness extended to the bottom of his ribs, and above his heart it was darker than anywhere else and seemed to be thickening there. He placed his palm on that spot, and his palm felt neither warmth nor a heartbeat. He sat there until dawn and didn't wake anyone. The Murney yard stood in a hollow past the 3rd bend and was not a fortress. It was a workshop. It was long and low and covered, and 3 chimneys rose above it, with smoke coming from 2 of them. The smoke was white and settled downward rather than upward. The fence was as tall as a man, and there was a gate in the fence, and the gate stood open. No one was guarding them. Murray said this was a bad sign, and that an open gate meant they weren't afraid of anyone inside. They entered in broad daylight and in plain sight because Askell decided that sneaking into a house where they were expected was a waste of energy. Inside, it didn't smell like metal. Inside, it smelled like an infirmary. In the first room stood floor-to-ceiling shelves, and on the shelves lay collars, more than 80 of them. In the second room was a furnace, and 3 people were working by the furnace. They looked at the newcomers but didn't get up. The third room was longer than the first 2 combined. In the third room were shelves, and on the shelves lay rings. There were 109 of them. Askell walked along the first shelf, stopped, and realized he couldn't go any further. A chill emanated from the rings, and it wasn't a uniform chill. It came in separate streams, and each ring chilled in its own way. One was dull and steady, another was twitching. The third sent out bursts of cold in time with something that Askell at first mistook for his own pulse, but then realized he hadn't felt his pulse beneath the gray for a full day. He stepped closer and placed his palm on the third ring, and he heard it. He didn't hear a voice, he heard an effort. He heard it the way you hear through a wall, someone pulling something heavy, unable to reach it, and trying again. It was steady and ancient, and it went on without stopping. It had been going on for a very long time. Askell pulled his hand away. Oben Rask asked what was there. Askell replied that there was a person there. Ilvin Rast stood at the far end of the hall by the window, and he'd been standing there the whole time. He wasn't hiding. He said he was glad the find had come on its own, and that now they could speak without the cleaners present. He took off his outer robe, leaving him in his undershirt, and unbuttoned the collar. He had a neck, collarbones, and chest, and all of it was gray. The gray formed a smooth border just above his nipples, and the border was old and distinct, like a shoreline. He said he was 59 years old and that he'd made his first transfer at 22. He said that by all calculations, he was supposed to have gone to sleep at 29. Askell asked what was keeping him here. Ilvin Rast pointed to the shelves and said they were what kept him going. He said that once every 4 years, he lay down on the table and they removed the accumulated material from him and carried it off to the ring. He said that after that, the ring dimmed, and after 2 cycles, it stopped taking any more. He said that over 37 years, he had used up 11 rings. Askell asked what happens to the person inside. Ilvin Rast replied calmly, without looking away. He said that the person inside is the one who holds it. He said that the ring is made from a carrier whose gray has reached the heart, and that on that day, the carrier is laid on the table and not killed. He is sealed inside. He said that the person inside the ring remains in that day forever. He does not age, he does not die, and he does not come to his senses. He draws it out. He draws out his gray, which never reached his heart, and along with his own, he draws out everything that is later taken from him. He said that the ring stops taking when the person inside can no longer cope. Askell asked what they do with the ring then. Ilvin Rast said they don't throw it away. He said they take it north and dump it. He said they dump it into the crevice. And then Askell sat right down on the floor of the third hall because he understood everything at once and saw 4 moves ahead. He asked about the empty ones. He asked where they came from. Ilvin Rast replied that the keeper of measure is obligated to answer a direct question about the record and that this is the only rule he obeys. He said that the void ones are the spent ones. He said that the ring in the slit opens sooner or later and that whatever emerges from it no longer remembers itself, has no face, and seeks something to latch onto. He said that the Void Ones go after the living not because they are hungry. They go because they are looking for a host. They do exactly what Askell Vorn did on his first day at the salt works, and they do it the only way left to them. Askell asked about the settling. He asked why, 41 years ago, the sky had turned the color of rust and why, in a single day, rifts had opened all over the world. Ilvin Rast remained silent the longest on this very point. Then he said that 41 years ago, the Bureau of Measurement carried out the only general transfer in its history. He said that in those years there was a plague, that the plague had been raging for 3 years, and that entire cities were dying out. He said that back then they gathered all the bearers they could find. There were 190 of them. He said they were linked in a chain and that they lifted the plague from the entire country in a single night. He said the plague had to be sent somewhere. He said there was nowhere to send it because there is no container of that size. He said that so they released it without a container. He said that whatever has no container settles, and that it settled on the earth itself. The grooves are the places where it settled. Ilvin Rast spoke the last sentence flatly, without emotion. He said that of the 190, only 2 remained on their feet that night, and that one of them was now standing before Askell, and that he had been a young helper back then, holding the chain at the edge. Askell stood up. He asked why he had been told all this. Ilvin Rast replied that he had told him because he was offering a job. He said that the find was in its 24th year, that it was turning gray at the ribs, and that it had at most a month to live. He said he was offering to lie on the table in 6 days and have the accumulated weight removed into a ring. He said that after that, Askell Vorn would become the second keeper of measure and would lie down once every 4 years, living another 30 years. Askell asked how many rings that would take. Ilvin Rast said that at his rate of consumption, it would take more than 11. He said the rings were there. He pointed to the 4th shelf. There stood a ring, new and bright, with the number 110 stamped on it. It had not a single blemish, and it wasn't cold at all. Ilvin Rast said that this ring was empty, that it had been cast for Askell Vorn, and that it was waiting for its owner. Askell stepped forward and took it in his hands. It was light and warm and completely lifeless. He thought that in 6 days it would grow cold. He put it back in its place and said he wouldn't lie down. Ilvin Rast nodded the way one nods in acknowledgement of the expected. He said the find was free to go and that he wouldn't call the cleaners. He said that in 20 days, Askell Vorn would come to this courtyard on his own, walking on his own 2 feet, and ask for a table. He said that for 37 years, everyone had done the same. He said that the pain in his chest was a better persuader than any overseer. They walked out through the open gates, and no one stopped them. Outside the gates, Miret called, asked why he had taken it. Askell looked at his hand. In it lay the 3rd ring from the top shelf, the very one that sent shivers through him in bursts. He didn't remember how he'd taken it. He said he couldn't leave it behind. He turned the ring toward the light and saw scratches on the inside. The scratches were crooked and fine, made from the inside with something blunt a very long time ago. They were letters. There were 7 of them. Velis Velm. They made the return trip in 2 days because Askell wouldn't let them stop. He carried the ring tucked under his shirt, and it chilled his chest. It was the only spot on his chest where he could still feel anything. He wasn't thinking about Rast or the table. He was thinking about the surname. Satra Velm opened the door above the tannery as if she'd been standing there all those days. She saw his face and understood everything before he even took out the ring. She stepped back into the room, sat down on a stool by the window, and rested her hands on her knees. She sat just as she had that day when he treated her burn. Askell placed the ring on the table, with the lettering facing up. Satra Velm didn't reach for it. She looked at him across the room and spoke in an even tone, not pausing because she knew that if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to start again. She said that her daughter had been 19. She said that Velis was a carrier and that she'd realized this at 16 when she healed a neighbor's boy's burn and transferred it to the doorframe. She said she'd raised her in secret and taught her in secret, forbidding her to take on more than one case a month. She said Velis hadn't listened because there's always someone to heal in the lower quarter. She said the gray had reached her chest within 2 years. She said that was when she went to the agency on her own. She said she asked for a table. She said she signed the paper with her own hand, and that Ilvin Rast himself had given her the paper, and that he was polite and explained everything honestly. He told her that her daughter wouldn't die. He said she would stay. He said it was the only way out, and he didn't lie about a single word. Satra Velm said she stood by the table and held her daughter's hand while the metal flowed. She said the metal was hot, and she didn't let go, and that the right side of her face was burned then. She said she had deliberately left that burn untreated for 24 years. She said she had carried it with her because it was the only thing she had left from that day. She looked at Askell and said that he had removed it. She said this without reproach, and that was the worst part of all. Then she said the most important thing. She said that a year after the feast, she went to the way station and demanded the ring back. She said they refused her. She said that she then wrote to the Merholt Guild, the Tolvain Guild, and the city way station and kept writing for 11 years, and that for all 11 years, her reports on the balance were actually about this. She said that Halder Merholt listened to her 4 times, and on the 5th occasion, he shut the door on her and escorted her out the gate without a letter. She said that her daughter's ring had gone south along with the cargo, that she'd lost track of it, and that she'd been searching for it for 23 years. Askell asked if she knew whose ring had been lying in the box under the floorboard. Satra Velm said she knew. She said she recognized it the very same day he left it with her. She said it belonged to someone else, that it wasn't Velis's, and that she'd kept the box in her possession longer than necessary anyway. Askell asked why she had gone to see him at all on that first day. She replied that she hadn't gone to see him. She said that he had come on his own and asked to touch her face, and that she had sat down and offered her cheek only because she decided the boy had gone mad. She said that when the burn subsided, she realized she'd found the second one. She said she'd been training him all this month, not so he could win the selection. She said she'd been training him so he could live long enough to open the ring. Askell asked if it could be opened. Satra Velm said she didn't know. She said that in 24 years she hadn't met a single person who would take it on. She said that a bearer was needed with a hand pure enough to take on everything the ring holds. She looked at his gray chest and didn't finish her sentence. Askell understood anyway. To open the ring, one must take into oneself what is inside it. He didn't have room even on his finger. They were interrupted from below. Hogg and Breck shouted a single word from the courtyard, and that word was a name. Darvin Skoll. He was standing in the alley, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were 12 men from the Tolvain Guild, and leading the way was a man carrying a covered stretcher. A stretcher Askell recognized immediately. Irma Tolvain stepped forward and didn't bother to greet them. She said her son had been dying for 3 days. She said the 7th knot had come undone and that the shadow had reached his knee. She said she had waited exactly as long as agreed and that the deadline had passed. She said she was taking the ring because it belonged to her. Askell replied that the ring was with Satra and that it wasn't for that. Irma Tolvain said she wouldn't bargain. Darvin Skoll stood behind her, looking away and keeping his hands behind his back, as he always did. Askell looked at him and asked loudly across the entire alley how much he had been paid for the northern route. Darvin Skoll didn't answer right away. He said he had been paid enough. Then he said one more thing, looking straight at Askell this time. He said that for 4 years he had led detachments, and for 4 years he had calculated how many people he would bring out of the rift and how many he would leave behind. He said that he had left 9 behind over the years, and that he had chosen each one himself. He said that now a man had appeared who could leave no one behind, and that this meant all 9 had been in vain. He said he couldn't live with that, and that it would be easier if such a man didn't exist. Askell realized that this was the only honest thing Darvin Skoll had said the entire time. The fight broke out without a command. Oben Rask stood in the passageway leading to the stairs because he always stood in passageways. Hagen Breck took on 2. Miret Kald went up to the roof, and stones began falling from there. Askell stepped forward, raised his hands, and reached out toward the person closest to him, Tolvain. And nothing happened. He reached out a second time and felt neither weight nor form. He felt nothing at all. His palms were on a stranger's chest and felt like 2 planks of wood. He lowered his eyes and saw that the gray had spread across the sternum, closed in and settled over the heart as a solid field. Ylvin Rast said 20 days. Ylvin Rast was wrong because he had calculated based on normal consumption and hadn't accounted for transmission through the medium. Askell Vorn stood in the middle of the alley and was empty. He was struck in the stomach and collapsed. He was kicked in the side and fell down. He lay on the stones and saw everything from the side and couldn't lift his head. He saw Hagna Brecka get knocked down by 3 men, then get back up, and then get knocked down again. He saw Miret jump from the roof into the middle of the alley and get grabbed by the hair. He saw Darvin Skoll walking toward the staircase and Oben Rask standing there, blocking his way. Oben Rask held the passageway alone and held it for a long time. He took down 4 of them. A 5th stabbed him in the side from below with a knife, a short professional strike, and stepped back. Oben didn't fall right away. He remained standing, still blocking the door, and was struck a second time. Askell crawled toward him over the stones, moving slowly because his legs wouldn't obey him. He crawled all the way there. Oben Rask was sitting with his back to the doorframe. His side was exposed, and a hand could fit inside it. He looked exactly the same as he had on that first day at the salt works. Askell placed both hands on him. He called out. He wasn't calling for a thread because he'd never had a thread. He was calling for weight. He was searching for the shape of the wound and the weight of the wound and the place where it held. He was searching just as he'd searched hundreds of times over these weeks, with his eyes closed and in the space of 6 heartbeats. He found nothing. His hands lay on someone else's blood and were simply hands. He did this 11 times. On the 11th time, Oben Rask raised his palm, placed it over Oben's palm, and held it there. He said nothing about debt and nothing about thanks. He said he remembered the salt on his lips and that the darkness had ended then. He said that was enough. He died after 2 breaths, and he died quietly. Askell Vorn sat on the rocks above him, his hands resting on his side, and did not move them. He was 24 years old. He knew how to restore a missing foot to a person. He knew how to lift a curse and return it to its source. He knew how to turn back a body's age by 12 years. He sat over his only friend and could not close the wound. Tolvain's people carried Sattervelm out of the room and carried out the chest. Irma Tolvain took both rings. She looked at Askell, sitting in a pool of blood, and did not finish him off, and Askell understood why only later. A dead host is useless. She told her people to leave. Darvin Skoll was the last to leave. Halfway down the alley, he turned and looked back, and there was no triumph in his face. The alley emptied. Hagenbreck crawled to the wall and sat down. Miret Kald got down on all 4s and was retching. Up above the tannery, an open door was slamming. Askell looked up only when he heard footsteps. A woman in an expensive city dress was walking down the alley, alone, stepping through the blood without looking where she was going. Thea Lan, 22 years old, had been Tarnhold's white thread. She had left the parade ground without looking back and had not returned to the lower quarter even once since that day. She approached and looked at Obenrask, then knelt down beside him and placed her fingers on his neck, because she had done so her whole life and could not help but do it. Then she looked at the gray patch above Askel's heart and spoke a single sentence. She said she had come because that morning, the Bureau of Measurement had taken the city's scales and sealed the ledger, and that measurement control had now been declared throughout all of Tarnhold.Satra. Velm confessed that Velis Velm was her daughter, and that she herself had signed the document on the table and held her daughter's hand while the metal flowed, and that she had been searching for this ring for 24 years. To unlock the seal, a vessel capable of absorbing everything the ring holds is needed, and Askel had not a single finger left with any free space. It's important to remember, the gray had spread past his sternum, and Askel completely lost his gift in the middle of battle. Obenrask died defending the passage, and Askel was unable to save him. Irma Tolvain led Satravelm away and took both rings. Darvin Skoll turned against Askel not for money, but because he couldn't accept that he'd abandoned people for nothing. In the end, Thea Lan arrived and reported that the Agency of Measures had sealed the city ledger and declared a census throughout all of Tarnhold. Thea Lan closed Obenrasku's eyes herself. She had done this 1,000 times over the past 22 years, and she usually did it quickly. This time, however, she took a long time because her fingers were trembling. Askel sat nearby on the rocks, his hands resting on the dead man's side, and he didn't move them. He felt neither the blood nor the cold, nor his own hands. A gray patch over his heart stood solid, and thin streaks ran upward from it along his neck. Moret Kald said they had to leave the street. Askel didn't move. Hagenbreck lifted him under the armpits and set him on his feet, as one would set down a sack, and Askel didn't resist. Vel Torgin arrived in the evening. He came alone, having walked all the way through the lower quarter, carrying in a sack the clothes he'd taken off. He placed the measuring collar on the table and said that wearing it was disgusting and that he couldn't live without it for even 9 days. He said that Askel Vorn had the gray area above his heart and that it would no longer move in a circle like everyone else's, but would move straight ahead. He said that in this state he had between 4 and 9 days left. He said that the collar holds the gray in place and keeps it there until death, and that the cleaners live to be 40 only because of this. And he said the most important thing. He said that while wearing the collar, one cannot carry anything, ever. Askel took the collar in his hands. It was light, and inside it had a smooth recess for the neck. Askel thought of Obenrask lying in the next room with his side exposed. He thought that he couldn't close that side anyway. He fastened the collar on himself. The metal fit snugly and grew warm in a single breath. The gray rose above his heart. The tongues on his neck stopped where they were. There was no pain. It felt as if someone had placed a board on his chest, pressed down, and walked away. Askel Vorn remained alive and remained empty. Obenrask was buried on the 3rd day in the communal field behind the dye works. Hagenbreck dug alone and wouldn't let anyone else have the shovel. He dug for 4 hours, and by the end, his hands were trembling because he was healthy, but not strong. People from the lower quarter carried things all day. The tinsmith Dolv brought a door hinge because that was all he had. Kemma's widow brought bread. 19 people arrived. They placed their copper coins on the gray thread, stood in silence, and left in silence. Thea Lan stood with them and did not step away even once, and no one said a word to her about the upper quarter. That is how Askel learned that he had a town. He learned this on the day he lost everything that made him useful to that town. Kel Orden arrived on the fourth day, accompanied by 12 of Merholt's men, all 12 of whom were armed. Mireille grabbed her knife. Kel Orden raised his empty hands. He said that the Merholt Guild no longer existed. He said that the Measure Bureau had sealed the city ledger and closed all 4 saltworks inlets, and that not a single slot had opened in Tarnhold in 3 days. He said that a guild without a slot was nothing more than a warehouse. He said that Halder Merholt had been sitting for 3 days, counting, and that in those 3 days he had counted everything. And he made a proposal. The guild provides people, money, and wagons. The guild asks for nothing except that the Northern House cease to exist. Askel asked why Merholt hadn't come himself. Kel Orden answered honestly. He said that the head of the guild does not go where there is no return. Then he looked at his left foot and said a second thing, and he said it on his own initiative. He said that 3 weeks ago he didn't have that foot. He said he would come no matter what, and would come even if Merholt changed his mind. Linvara Gis was taken from the town weighhouse at night. He was held in the accounting room on the 2nd floor and was not in chains because accountants are not kept in chains. Hagen Breck unhinged the door. Meret walked along the ledge and brought the man down from the staircase. Kel Orden stood below with his men and was not needed. Lenvar Gis came out on his own and carried 3 bundles of sheets under his cloak. He was pale and angry, and the first thing he said was not "thank you." He said that Overseer Rast had been burning the right side of the sheets for 4 hours, burning 1 page at a time and forcing him to watch. He said he hadn't managed to copy everything. He said he'd managed to copy the most important parts. They spread the sheets out on the floor above the tannery and read all night. There were 3 bundles, and they spanned 41 years. The first bundle was a register of rings, 109 lines. Each line contained a name, age, the date of casting, and the city. The oldest entry was 39 years old. The newest was 4 months old. Askel read the names and realized he was looking at a list of people who were now lying on shelves 3 days' journey away and holding out. He found the entry numbered 46, Velis Velm, 19 years old, Tarnhold, 24 years ago. The second bundle was a schedule. Once every 2 years, the agency collected the spent rings, transported them north, and dumped them into the distant chasm beyond the 4th outpost. The next convoy was due to leave in 6 days and would carry 9 rings. Meret called, counted them aloud, and said that 9 rings meant 9 empty ones, and that in a year's time, someone's detachment would meet them at the gap. The third bundle was thin. It contained 9 sheets, and they were 17 years older than the rest. It was the chain list, 190 names. Next to 188 of them was the same note, did not rise. Next to 2, there was no note. First on the list was Ilvin Rast, 22 years old. Second was Satra Velm, 23 years old. Askel sat poring over the sheet for a very long time. He remembered how she had opened the door for him and told him she served on Tuesdays. He remembered how, in a single night, she had found a line in the city register about a discovery that reveals itself. He remembered how she had said she taught him quickly not for the selection. He realized that all these weeks he'd been heading in the wrong direction. Irma Tolvain had taken him into her home, alone and without guards, and that in itself was the answer. Odd Tolvain lay in the far room, and the shadow reached him to his waist and went on. Irma Tolvain was pale and did not sit down. She said she would not give up the rings. Askel replied that he was not asking for them. He placed a sheet from the first bundle in front of her and had her read line 46. He said that inside her ring lay a 19-year-old girl from Tarnhold. He said that she had been holding him for 24 years without a break, and that she had also held whatever Irma Tolvain had poured into it. Irma Tolvain read the line 4 times. Then she sat down. She said she had bought the ring from the agency for a lot of money and that they had sold it to her as an object. She said they hadn't told her. Askell said they hadn't told her because she hadn't asked. He named his price and stated it plainly. He will remove the 7th knot from Old Tolvain. He will do this in the measuring yard and only there, because there's nowhere to remove the knot in Tarnhold, but there is a place in the northern basin. In exchange, Irma Tolvain will hand over both rings. She'll hand over the people and the wagons, and she'll bring Sathruvelm back alive. Irma Tolvain listened and said she agreed to everything except the last part. Askell asked why. She answered, and at her reply, he stood up. She said that no one was holding Sathruvelm captive. She said that the old woman had been living in her house for 4 days, eating at her table and sleeping in a room with an unlocked door. She said that Sathruvelm herself had asked her to take her away that day. She said the old woman had bargained with her for one thing, a spot in the caravan heading north. Sathruvelm came out to them on her own. She was dressed for the road, looked composed, and there wasn't a trace of guilt on her face. Askell showed her the 3rd bundle and the sheet with the chain. He asked why she had remained silent. Sathruvelm did not answer right away. She said that she was 23 that night and that she had been placed 12th from the end in the chain. She said that the chain had worked for 4 hours. She said that a man named Dorn Velm had stood next to her, that he had been her husband for 2 years, and that he had collapsed at the 3rd hour and never got up again. She said that out of 190, 2 had risen. She said that the Moor had been lifted from the entire country that night, and that 188 people and all the land beneath them had paid the price for it. She said that 17 years later she gave birth to a daughter, and that 19 years later she voluntarily handed that daughter over to the agency with her own hand. She said she had been searching for a way to bring her back for 24 years. She looked at the gray patch over Askell's heart and at the collar and spoke her final words. She said she hadn't been looking for a weapon. She said she had been looking for a carrier who would live to see the end. Murray Cald returned from the northern road on the 6th day, alone and a day ahead of schedule. She tossed a sack onto the table, sat down, drank for a long time, and only then began to speak. She said that the measured courtyard stood in its old place and its gates were still open. She said that there were no longer 14 cleaners there. She said there were 81 of them, that they were all wearing collars, that they'd been brought from all 3 houses, and that there hadn't been a gathering like this in 40 years. She said a table had been set up in the 3rd hall. She said the table was clean and set, and that a single ring stood on a stand next to it. Askell asked what number it was. Murray replied that it was 110. She said she'd seen it through the window from the hill using a telescope, and that she'd seen one more thing, and that this thing she disliked the most of all. She said that every morning the warden goes out to the gate and stands there for a quarter of an hour, looking at the southern road. He isn't waiting for anyone with a weapon. He's waiting for one person. And he didn't leave the gate open out of carelessness. He left it open because he's certain that this person will come on his own, arrive on his own 2 feet, and ask for a table. Askell Vorn unfastened his collar in 4 heartbeats to check. The gray chain shot up immediately, without any buildup, and reached his throat, so he fastened the metal back in place while already sitting on the floor. He sat there for a moment and then looked at his people. There were 6 of them in the room above the tannery, and outside the walls stood the men of 2 guilds, the City Without Slits, and 109 men on the shelves 3 days' journey away. He said they'd leave tomorrow before dawn. Sathruvelm said they wouldn't leave tomorrow. She said that a convoy carrying 9 spent rings would depart from the northern house in a day's time, and that if they were late, the 9 people would enter the rift and never return from there as human beings. She said they had to leave now. Askell put on the measuring collar to stop the gray, thereby saving his life at the cost of completely losing his gift. Oban's funeral brought together the entire lower quarter and the remnants of the Merholt Guild, led by Kell Orden, Thea Lan, and Vel Torgan, sided with Askell. The rescued Lenvar Gis brought out 3 bundles of sheets, a register of 109 rings, where number 46 is listed as Velis Velm, a schedule of convoys dumping spent rings into the distant chasm, and a list from 40 years ago, where out of 190 names, only 2 are unmarked, Ilvin Rast and Satra Velm. It's important to remember, Satra herself went to Irma Tolvain to join the northern convoy, and all these years she's been searching not for a weapon, but for a carrier who would survive. Irma hands over both rings in exchange for removing the 7th knot from her son. 81 purifiers have gathered in the measuring yard, and a table set with ring number 110 stands there. The caravan carrying the 9 spent rings will depart in a day. They set out that very night and traveled without stopping, overtaking the wagon train at the 2nd outpost. The wagon train was parked in the dark on the side of the road, and no one was guarding it because there was no need to. 9 crates stood on the wagon under a mat. Hagen Breck lifted the mat, and such a chill emanated from the 9 rings that the horses recoiled. Askell stepped forward and placed his palm on them, but felt nothing because the collar blocked everything in both directions. Satra Velm placed her hand next to his, stood there for a moment, and said that 3 of the 9 were still holding. She said the other 6 were empty. She said that an empty ring was a person who had given up and no longer cared where they were being taken. They turned the cart around and led it with them. They entered the hollow at dawn. The gates of the measured courtyard stood open, just as they had last time. 81 cleaners stood in the courtyard in 2 long rows, standing loosely and out of formation, and none of them held weapons. They simply stood there, and a steady chill emanated from their collars, preventing the frost in the courtyard from melting, even though it was early autumn. Ilvin Rast was waiting on the porch of the 3rd hall. He wore an undershirt with its collar unbuttoned, and his gray border remained in its usual place. He looked at the cart, at the people from the 2 guilds, and at Satra Velm, and his expression changed only once, and only when he looked at her. He said he hadn't seen her in 41 years. Satra Velm replied that she had seen him every day. Ilvin Rast let them inside. He did not give a single order to the cleaners, and they did not move. Kell Orden later said that this was more terrifying than any fight. Askell understood his calculation immediately and realized that it was correct. The Keeper of Measure wanted to see. He had kept the book for 37 years, and in his book, that line was sealed. He was the only person in the world who was truly curious to see if it would be revealed. First, Askell paid his debt. Ada Tolvain was carried into the 3rd hall on a stretcher and laid on the floor between the shelves. Askell unfastened the collar and removed it, and the gray substance rose immediately. He found the 7th knot beneath the right knee in 6 heartbeats, cut it out along with the root, held it in his hand, went out into the courtyard with it, and pressed it into the frozen earth of the hollow. The earth took it in. It took it so easily that he didn't even feel any resistance, and that was when he finally understood everything. The earth here had been the keeper for 41 years already. It was second nature to her. He returned to the hall, fastened the collar, and sat down right on the floor because he couldn't stand. The gray rose to his throat, encircled him, and stopped beneath his chin. Irma Tolvain stood over her son, watching as the shadow receded down his leg and the flesh returned, and she didn't say a word to Askell. She simply set both boxes of rings on the floor. Then she led her people out into the courtyard because she didn't have the strength to watch any longer. Satravelm did not speak for long. She said that the chain had been assembled incorrectly 41 years ago, and that the mistake was not in the number of people. She said that 190 bearers had lifted the plague from the land in 4 hours, and that it was work, and good work at that. She said that the trouble began when the plague was carried further. She said they had pushed it into the void because they'd decided the earth would take it. She said the earth did take it. She said no one had asked the earth, and no one had asked the bearers themselves, and that 188 people that night had not given anything voluntarily because they'd been told only half the story. She said that the residue clings to the intermediary exactly where there is no consent. She said that over the course of 24 years, she had tested this on herself 11 times. She said that lifting a curse from a person at their request costs half as much as lifting it without their consent. Askell Vorn recalled his first night. He remembered Oben Rask lying unconscious on the salt flats. He remembered Hagenbreck, who hadn't asked him for anything. He remembered the old woman at the tannery who sat down and offered her cheek because she'd decided the boy had gone mad. He examined his gray hand again and realized what it was made of. Ilvin Rast listened, standing by the window, and took notes. He did so openly, making no attempt to hide it, and when Satra finished, he said that for the first time in 37 years, he was hearing something that wasn't in the book. Then he made his final proposal, stating it without pressure. He offered a deal. He said he would find 8 rings for Askell Vorn within 10 years. He said that the Department of Measurement, with 2 overseers, would seal all the country's fissures within a century, and that this would cost several hundred men on the shelves. He said that arithmetic was on his side, and that it had been on his side for 41 years. Askell replied with a single sentence. He said that arithmetic counts only those who are asked. He unfastened his collar, laid it on the floor, and did not put it back on even once that day. They began with the first shelf. Askell placed both palms on the ring and called not to the weight, but to the one inside. He found him immediately. Inside was a force, and the force was steady and endless, and it asked for permission to be released. The first ring had held him for 41 years, and inside it was a man named Ott Revin, who didn't understand the question at first because no one had asked him anything for 39 years. On the second try, he let go. The ring grew warm in Askell's palms and became ordinary, dull metal, and everything it had held poured out of it, passed right through Askell, and sank into the floor of the hall and into the earth of the basin. Askell braced for the impact. There was no impact. The residue hardly settled on him at all because the holder released it on its own. By the 30th ring, he was working without looking, his hands moving of their own accord, and he mixed up the names but kept the count straight. By the 60th, his nose was bleeding, and he didn't wipe it away. By the 90th, he stopped standing between the rings, and Hanbreck brought them to him and held them aloft while he placed his palms on them. Merholt's men and Tolvain's men stood along the walls and said nothing, and Mirith called counted aloud, her voice the only sound in the third hall. The ground of the hollow was settling. By midday, the snow in the courtyard had sunk, and a dark web of cracks spread across it. The cracks were smooth and thin as seams. Lenvar Gis carried the instrument out into the courtyard and set it on a tripod, and the needle rested on the stop and remained there until evening. Beyond the wall of the basin stood a distant slit. It had held for 17 years, and its mouth was visible from the porch. By evening, it had gone out. It did not collapse, nor did it make a sound. It simply ceased to exist, leaving a frozen salt lowland in its place. 81 cleaners watched this from the courtyard, and the first to remove a collar was Vel Torgin. 9 more followed him. By nightfall, 44 collars lay on the ground. Askell spent the night removing the gray from them and did so on request, which is why he was paid half as much, and yet, by dawn, he could no longer feel his legs. He left collar number 46 for last, and he left it that way on purpose. Satra Velm brought it herself and sat down on the floor beside him. Askell placed his palms on it, called out, and found it. Inside was a force, subtle and very stubborn, that had been flowing without pause for 24 years. He asked for permission. Velis Velm didn't answer him because she had nothing to say. She simply stopped resisting. The ring grew warm and limp and became empty, and 24 years of someone else's labor passed through Askell's palms and sank into the ground. And along with that, what the ring had been holding all along came out. It was a 19-year-old girl, and she was exactly the same as she had been on the day it was cast, and she managed to take a single breath. Satra Velm took her by the hand. She held her just as she had held her back then at the table. This time, she didn't hold her for long.
Velis Velm closed her eyes and died her own death, 24 years late. And she died in warmth, in her mother's arms. Satra Velm sat on the floor of the third hall and did not cry. She told Askell that now it was her turn. She asked him to remove everything she had been wearing since that night, and she asked directly and aloud, repeating it twice so that he could not pretend he hadn't heard. Askell said she would die. Satra Velm replied that 188 people had died 41 years ago behind her back, that she had been keeping count of them for 4 decades, and that it was time to close the tally. She said she would not be the keeper of others' lives for even one more day. He removed everything from her. It took less time than he'd thought. She let go more easily than any of the 109 had. Satra Velm died at dawn, sitting against the wall and holding her daughter's hand. Her face was serene, and the burn had long since faded. Ylvin Rast outlived her by 4 days. When the last ring was opened, his own 11 sources ran dry, and the gray line on his chest began to rise for the first time in 37 years, and it rose quickly. Askell offered him the same thing he offered everyone else, and he offered it twice. Ylvin Rast refused both times. He said that he had kept the book for 37 years, and that if he were to ask, he would have to admit that all 109 lines in it were written incorrectly. He said he would not do that. He died sitting at his desk, writing until his very last day. In the end, he wrote 111 sheets and left all 111 to Lenvar Gis. Ring number 110 remained empty, and Hagen Breck flattened it with a hammer on the 4th day, a hammer he lifted himself that very day. Years passed, and the years fell in 3 segments. The first segment came a month later. Lenvar Gis reopened the ledger in Tarnhold and inscribed the rule of consent as the very first entry, writing it in such a way that it could not be crossed out. He became the first bookkeeper who was accountable not to the guild, but to the ledger, and he died in that position 20 years later. The second harvest took place a year later. Not a single sliver remained in the Tarnhold district. Both cooperatives fell apart, and Halder Merholt left for the south with 3 wagons and never again counted aloud. Irma Tolvain stayed behind and ran the infirmary together with Thea Lan, and her son walked on his own 2 feet, limping on his right leg, a limp that no one could cure because Askell refused. Darvin Skoll left town that same week. He came to the measuring yard on the 2nd day and asked to have what he was carrying removed from him, and he asked for a long time. Askell Vorn replied with a single sentence and said nothing more. He said he wouldn't take it. He said the debt remained with him. No one recorded where Darvin Skoll went. The 3rd survey took place 4 years later. There were 11 bearers in the country, and all 11 were alive. All 11 worked by the book, taking no more than 1 per month and only upon request. Mireille Cald had traveled to 6 cities over the years and found 9 of them herself.
Hagen Breck stood guard at the infirmary door, keeping watch alone and letting no one through without being recorded. He died of old age in his bed at 68, which was 18 years longer than the average lifespan of a rebuilt person. Askell Vorn wore his measured collar until the end of his life. He took it off a total of 9 more times, each time for the sake of a person who asked aloud, and each time he paid. The gray grew down to his chin and stopped there for good. He lived another 42 years. He could not heal a single scratch. He sat in the infirmary at Tai Lan and taught strangers a common craft. Over the years, he taught more than 200 people, and he did not teach a single one of them the art of teleportation, because teleportation cannot be taught. He always told them the same story, the one he told on the very first day. He told them about a boy named Tabret who, 4 decades ago, had been crushed by a beam while dismantling an old drying shed. He said that he had been kneeling over him at the time, calling upon the thread, and the thread snapped 11 times, and the boy died. He said that the beam had been just 2 steps away. He said he didn't realize this until 4 years later, and that realizing such a thing 4 years later is far too late. And he left behind 4 lines which Lenvar Gis inscribed on the first page of the book. From then on, everyone who came to the infirmary afterward was taught to begin with those lines. The wound does not disappear. The wound has a keeper. The keeper can only be replaced if he agrees. A fee is always charged for a change, and the one who made the change pays it. In the measuring yard, Askell removed the 7th knot from Odd Tolvane and returned it to the earth of the basin, after which he opened all 109 rings, asking the sealed ones for permission and thus paying almost nothing with the remainder. The distant slit went out forever, proving that the slits are settled more that the earth is ready to take back. Velis Velm died in her mother's arms, 24 years late, and Satra Velm voluntarily surrendered her entire 40-year debt and died at dawn. Ilvin Rast refused to ask and died 4 days later, and the ring 110 was crushed. Askell Vorn lived another 42 years in a restraining collar, having lost his gift forever, and left behind a book of the rules of harmony and 4 lines from which healers are now taught.